Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Wright. I am the Marketing and Communications Specialist here at Equal Justice Works. Welcome back to another installment of My Impact, our interview series where we speak with alumni to shine a light on what's possible with an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. Today, we are speaking with Alexander Chen, a 2017 fellow who now serves as the founding director of the LGBTQ Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law School. First of all, can you tell us about your journey to law school? What led you to start a career in public interest?
Sure. So it's a long story, but I'll tell the short version. I think that I never thought I would be a lawyer. I didn't plan to go to law school. I ended up here because of my own lived experience, right? So, as a young person, I moved to New York City. Shortly after graduating college, in order to, be able to live more authentically as myself, as a transgender person. And I had this experience of sort of, the reason I moved to New York City, I guess the short version of it is the reason I moved there is I was living in Asia at the time. I was an American citizen, but I was educated abroad, and I went to college abroad. And then I was living in Asia when I realized that I really wanted to sort of more affirmatively live openly as a man, and moved to New York City because at the time it was where I could get like free or low cost legal services. And access to medical care in order to affirm my gender, even though I didn't have health insurance and I didn't, have the resources to hire an attorney or anything like that, right? And so I was really benefited by the kinds of legal services that things like the Equal Justice Works Fellowship enable people to have. And I also experienced just how difficult it was for many people who were my friends and in my community to be able to navigate the very complex bureaucratic systems that we have in our country, and also just the amount of like discrimination and violence that people in marginalized communities face, right? And so I think my lived experience was of being somebody who at that time didn't have a lot of, physical resources, but did have a lot of educational resources in order to help myself navigate these systems. So I was able to sort of get access to these types of services and sort of, use these kinds of self-help materials in order to advocate for myself and in order to do things like change my name, change my gender, get, identity documents, get access to necessary healthcare. And I had so many friends who were not able to do that. And it was not for any lack of trying or because they weren't good people or any of that, right? They were actually really amazing, kind, wonderful people who were just dealing with, homelessness and sex work and survival work and intimate partner violence and family rejection. And it was just so frustrating to me to see that. And I really just thought, why is it that I live in what everyone keeps saying is the richest country in the world, but I have people who I'm close to who are struggling so badly for want of, really very basic access to services, right? And so that was really what inspired me to go to law school. I thought, there's got to be something I can do about this, even if it's just to help one person. I can do a little bit of what other people did for me, and that was what inspired me to come.
That's amazing. We're going to get into it more, obviously, but it seems like your career is just sort of like a full circle moment. So you were a 2017 fellow at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Can you briefly just tell us about the work that you did as a fellow, any obstacles, successes, I hope more so. Love to just hear more about your experience.
Sure. So yeah, I was a fellow for 2 years at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is one of a number of organizations that has been sort of fighting for LGBTQ plus rights in our country for over at this point I think 40 years. And NCLR is one of the organizations that was behind many of or participated in many of the biggest victories of the LGBTQ movement, including, for example, litigating the California marriage equality cases. And the reason that I went there is that they have also been a longtime leader on trans rights. They had the first trans youth project in the country, and they were really working on this issue at a time when it really wasn't nearly as prominent as now. If you cast your mind back to when I was a fellow and, when I was in law school, you kind of talked about my career like it was going full circle, but actually when I went to law school, I was really nervous about whether I could make a career that really centered um, trans rights and LGBTQ plus rights, but really, rights that really focused on the marginalized people within that community, right? And I thought at the time, this was 2011 when I decided to go to law school, so over a decade ago. So we're talking about a time where there wasn't Laverne Cox and there wasn't the transgender tipping point and the cover of Time magazine and transparent and like all of these things that happened later that sort of really the trans community has been around this entire time, but it really didn't have that level of media attention, right? It was kind of treated as a joke to be transgender. And as recently as 10 years ago, it was totally acceptable within liberal circles to make really awful jokes about transgender people, right? And I think we can all cast our minds back to that time and go, oh, people said a lot of ignorant things back then that they wouldn't say today. And that was the landscape that I was facing when I went in. And so I didn't know if it would be something I was able to do, but I was really inspired by the fact that NCLR has long worked on the issue and has long worked on areas of law that affect LGBT people that are less flashy, that really are very important, like things like family law and immigration law and criminal justice reform. And so I think their commitment to trans rights was really part and parcel of their longstanding commitment to marginalized communities within the LGBTQ community. So in terms of some of the work I did there, my project did focus on advancing rights for trans youth, which at the time also again seemed perhaps niche and now has completely exploded to the forefront of public consciousness. And the reason that I focused on the area was really because of just how vulnerable trans youth are, right? And so folks may or may not know this, right? But up to half of trans kids have contemplated or attempted suicide seriously, and trans youth, sort of face a really wide range of discrimination across the society, but also within their families and within schools that really affects, their abilities. Sort of, it kind of sets a trajectory for their whole life, right? And what's really sad about that is that we have a lot of research now that shows that when trans kids are affirmed by their families, when they are able to get affirmation socially and also medically, they actually have lifelong outcomes that are very comparable to their cisgender peers. And that's quite amazing because really, that doesn't mean that you don't get all these messages of hate from society, right? Like you don't get all of these governors and all of these state legislatures trying to pass these really horrible laws. You don't get people saying the kinds of things that people say about transgender people. And so, but despite that, just having, the support from your immediate surroundings is enough to get people to be so happy to be accepted and affirmed and be able to live authentically that they actually do have these comparable outcomes. So, for me, it was really, I think, very near and dear to my heart to work on this issue. And in terms of what I did, I had a 3-pronged project. So I focused on, impact litigation, legislative and policy advocacy, and the public education. And so I did some things in each of those categories. So for the first one, for impact litigation, NCLR is an impact litigation organization, which means that they do strategic litigation to achieve certain ends. And so I worked on some very high profile transgender rights cases while I was there. 2 ones that I'll name, name 3. One is I worked on 2 of the challenges to the transgender military ban, which was instituted while I was there. And one of our plaintiffs, for example, Reagan Kibbe, was at that time a student in the U.S. Naval Academy, and so the question was, okay, well, what's going to happen? Have I been expelled? Can I graduate? But the whole point of going to the Naval Academy is to be commissioned as an officer. So what's going to happen to my future, right? And so we had a number of young plaintiffs who, were either in that kind of situation or were planning to enroll or had enrolled and, weren't sure what was going to happen to their careers. Then the second case that I worked on was another case involving a trans youth, the Prescott v. Rady Children's Hospital case, and that was a very sad case that involved a young trans teen who had been committed to a hospital for psychiatric monitoring because of his suicidality, because of the bullying he was experiencing because of his transgender status. And unfortunately, while in that facility, in the hospital in San Diego, Rady Children's Hospital, he was repeatedly misgendered by staff, despite his parents trying to advocate on his behalf. He ended up getting discharged early from his 72-hour hold because he they determined it was actually worse for him to be there than not be there. And then very tragically, about a month later, he died by suicide. And so that was a case that we brought, which established that under the Affordable Care Act, it can be sex discrimination to discriminate on against somebody on the basis of gender identity, which was later the ruling that the Supreme Court made in the Bostock case in the Title VII context 3 years later, and also one of the first cases that recognized that misgendering somebody can be a cognizable form of harm in and of itself. And I think it was a very tragic set of facts, but it was helpful in sort of illustrating how harmful it can be for people to not be affirmed. And then the third case, a third case that I worked on was a landmark case in the Ninth Circuit, Edmo v. Corizon, which was one of the first Court of Appeals case to establish the proposition that it can be a violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment to withhold medically necessary gender affirming surgery from a transgender prisoner. So I had a really amazing experience working on these cases that were very really important and really impactful for the community on the litigation side. And then two projects that sort of I played more of a leading role in myself in initiating. One was on the education side. I co-authored with Asaf Orr, the head of NCLR's Trans Youth Project, the Trans Youth Handbook, which is the first comprehensive nationwide legal resource guide for trans kids and their families about their rights in a lot of different areas. I also played a role in a piece of legislation that we helped to write and get passed in California, AB 2119, which is a bill that made California the first state where trans kids who are in foster care get access to gender affirming care. And so I had a really, I think, amazing experience working at NCLR as part of my Equal Justice Works Fellowship. And I think that because of the fellowship, it was a more rich experience because I was able to work across multiple different areas. I was able to not just do the litigation, but also to do some policy and legislative work and to really learn how those things can go hand in hand.
That's amazing. We love to hear all of that. Just speaking of your collaboration with your host organization and the resources that you created, I believe you collaborated also with your sponsors. Is that correct? You were sponsored by Baker McKenzie and Salesforce. I would love to hear a little bit more about that collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there were a number of different things that we did in order to work together, and I gave a number of sort of speeches and presentations at Baker and Salesforce, and participated in some kinds of things that they organized. Like, for example, Baker plays a key role in organizing something called the Children's Rights Summit here in Northern California, and sort of attending those kinds of things. But I would say that probably the key piece of work product that we collaborated on substantially is the Trans Youth Handbook, and there, both of my sponsor organizations were helpful in a variety of different ways. So firstly, in terms of people power, right? So they had teams of pro bono attorneys that really helped me research various aspects. The handbook covers a lot of different areas of law, and it covers a lot of state law as well. And so, as one person, I really didn't have the resources to kind of go and research those things, but I was able to organize, kind of days of service and things like that, where pro bono attorneys came in and they, volunteered and, researched tranches of information. And then, when it came to publishing it, they were also very helpful. The Baker and Salesforce teams collaborated on, I believe, web design of the handbook, and then also hosting it and also putting on a very professional platform, the Turtle platform that actually my clinic at Harvard now has a contract with, because it sort of makes these very slick looking resources that are very easy to edit and very good to access online, right? And so really, thinking about the audience of young people and, how sort of like always online they are, and sort of like thinking about bringing legal services and resources into the 21st century and into ways that people are actually going to be able to meaningfully access them. I think having that tech support and having the resources of those big organizations was super helpful in bringing a product that ultimately was able to reach many more people. And in fact, because we put it on those platforms, I think within the first couple of months of launching, within the first month of launching the Trans Youth Handbook, we had over 5,000 unique visitors, right? And so I think that level of reach was also because of the platforms that Baker and Salesforce had, and sort of their collaboration with me, and also sort of like pushing out the resource to a lot of different kinds of audiences.
That's really amazing. Yeah, what a great way to leverage that relationship. And speaking of just the Equal Justice Works community generally, now as an alumni, you're part of this broader community of passionate legal professionals that spans the country, and a very broad range of legal specialties and issue areas. Have you been able to leverage that community in any way in your career now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I have been leveraging it the entire time, is maybe the way I would put it. The Equal Justice Works has a really strong track record of having supported a number of people and projects that have actually turned out to be very important for this movement. So I'll just name a couple of examples. So for example, Shannon Minter, the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, had an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. I believe Ash McGovern, who now heads, basically the some kind of LGBTQ equity office for the mayor of New York, was an Equal Justice Works fellow. Lisa Mote, who is the deputy legal director of the National Center for Trans Equality, was an Equal Justice Works fellow. Probably most well known, Chase Strangio, who is the head of the Trans Rights Project at the ACLU, within their LGBT rights project is EGW alum. And so, I think it was really like throughout my time kind of applying for the fellowship and then being a fellow, and then, afterwards, like connecting with other Equal Justice Works fellows in my field has been super helpful. And I would say the other thing that's been very helpful is connecting with people that I met at the Equal Justice Works conference who were in my cohort, right? Because they were not doing LGBT work, they were doing other kinds of work, but then they had different kinds of experiences with, sort of like starting their organizations or, moving into different places, which after I left my fellowship and took my current job were very helpful to talk to them about their experiences with these types of things, right? Because really, like, law school teaches you how to be a lawyer, but I think in order to be somebody who makes social change, there are a lot of different organizational and leadership and financial and, like sort of community organizing skills that are very helpful. And I think the Equal Justice Works Fellowship really sets you up to have to think about your work in a more entrepreneurial way, which gives you more agency and autonomy and an ability to impact things in a way that is less traditional, which is really ultimately what's necessary if we're going to change the structural inequities in our society.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate you pointing out sort of that it takes all kinds of people to do this work. And that's something that we try to, address through our trainings that we offer to fellows. So thank you for calling that out. Currently, you work as the founding director of the LGBTQ plus Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the work that you are currently doing in that role?
Absolutely. So it's been a really exciting time. I've now been running the clinic for 2 years, and our work really, I think, tracks that model that I described of the three prongs of my fellowship project. Right? We do impact litigation work, we do some policy and legislative advocacy, and then we do some public education work. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we try to do and why. So I think first of all, I think part of what's very exciting about this opportunity for me is really thinking about what the future of LGBTQ plus advocacy looks like, and being housed in an academic institution just kind of gives you a little bit more freedom to really think about that, because you're not under the same kinds of pressures you are in a nonprofit in terms of trying to think about, well, what do donors want and what do foundations want, what do supporters want. So, and I think also kind of allows me to think a little bit more intermediate to long term rather than, kind of always responding to crisis. So, the mission statement of the clinic is to focus on the kinds of issues that will define the future of LGBTQ advocacy, which we believe means focusing on marginalized communities within the LGBTQ community and thinking about the ways in which the work of social justice for our community connects to broader movements for social justice. So we prioritize three areas. We prioritize issues that disproportionately affect LGBTQ plus people of color, issues that disproportionately affect transgender, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, and intersex individuals, and issues that and this is a little bit broader, but really that look to the idea of LGBTQ plus people as whole persons who are connected and have many facets to their lives, and sort of supporting them in being their full selves rather than sort of promoting a model where, you have to be a certain kind of person to sort of thrive in this community, right? So it's not so much the it gets better, move to New York City, live like Will and Grace. It's, do you come from a Southern Baptist community in North Carolina and you want to stay there and you want to thrive where you are? Let's figure out how to make that happen, right? And so some of the things that we're working on, for example, that I'll just name, we just went public, for example, with a collaboration that we have with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. We're representing three young transgender people who were all arrested last year during Black Lives Matter protests in South Florida, and were booked into the local correctional jail and just subjected to a lot of the demeaning treatment that's very common to transgender people in the criminal justice system, right? They, were subject to demeaning strip searches that were unnecessary. They were, called derogatory names. They were asked if they were sex workers. They were separated from other people. They were, had their private medical information unnecessarily revealed to bystanders, right? So all of the sort of things that people are very afraid of for transgender, they experienced because they, were engaged in this form of civic protest. So we have come public with a demand letter to the mayor of Miami-Dade County to ask and invite her to be in a conversation with us about what kinds of structural reforms can be made in South Florida to prevent this kind of thing from happening again to transgender people who are simply, trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. Another case that we are working on right now with the Center for Constitutional Rights is a case that involves the way that LGBTQ plus people are being treated by the housing services of a major metropolitan city, especially people who are vulnerable and unhoused. There, in that case, we're seeing just a lot of the different ways in which, LGBTQ plus people, especially transgender people who are poor and who are people of color, are just seen as people that have no power and no ability to have any accountability for the kind of treatment they've experienced. So we've had horrifying experiences that people have shared with us about, the kinds of physical, sexual, and verbal abuse that they have received from not just residents, but also shelter staff. We have people who have told stories of being chased out of a homeless shelter, but with a baseball bat by a resident, by a staff member,
Wow.
right? And then suffered horrible injuries as a result. And multiple people who have elected to live on the streets and engage in survival work rather than be in the system because they feel more safe, right? And so what kind of indictment is that of our system, that is how people feel about it? And so in that particular case, we are negotiating with that city right now to try and see if we can come to accord for some structural reforms that will hopefully improve the way that people are being treated in that system. And then on the legislative side, I'll just name a couple of the projects that we're particularly excited about. Two collaborations that we have. One is that we're collaborating with Interact Advocates for Intersex Youth, which is the world's leading intersex advocacy organization. And we're collaborating with them on some efforts that they're making to use legislation around the country to ban the continuing process that is still going on of performing non-consensual genital surgeries on intersex youth, right? And so you may have heard this year there have been all of these bills in the news about trying to ban transgender kids from getting access to gender affirming care. One thing that is almost never reported on is not only is that a violation of people's constitutional and human rights and against the sort of prevailing standards of practice for all medical associations, but also they almost always contain a carve out that says the only kind of surgeries you can do are non-consensual surgeries that are on the genitals of intersex infants. And the idea, of course, comes from the same sort of framework of like, oh, we have to fix people and put them into a gender binary so that they don't make other people uncomfortable, right? And so, frequently what happens even now is that people find out decades later that this kind of surgery was performed upon them when they were young. The parents are pressured into it when the infant is still in the delivery room, and they are like, oh no, there's something wrong with my child, right? That's kind of what they're implied by the doctors. And so then they go ahead and do it because they're afraid their child won't fit in. But the result, of course, can be lifelong trauma and pain from having that kind of thing happen to your body without your knowledge or consent when you were a child. And so we partnered together to advance legislation in different states that will, and currently I think there are bills going forward in various forms in Rhode Island and New York that will legislatively bar this practice, and that's a very exciting project, and we've been sort of very engaged in that particular collaboration. And another project I'll just mention is that we also started another coalition, a legislative coalition called the Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition. That's a partnership between us and the Chosen Family Law Center and the American Psychological Association Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy. It's a mouthful. And what we're doing together as three organizations coming together to form PLAC is working to advance the rights of people who are in multiple domestic partnerships or in multiple parent situations. And so following the passage of a ordinance in Somerville that made Somerville the first city in the nation in Massachusetts where you can get domestically partnered with more than one person, we've now assisted two other municipalities within Massachusetts, Cambridge and Arlington, in passing similar domestic partnership ordinances. And we're actually today launching an effort in Northern California to have similar municipal legislation passed there. And that, again, is a really exciting initiative because, I think for a long time, right, there's been this a little bit of a sort of idea that would be a bad thing, that during the times of marriage equality, people always said, well, it would be horrible if then more people could get partnered with each other. And I think really the question is, well, why is that true when in fact this work has actually taught me a lot personally about the fact that actually, like we said then, love is love, and people actually want very mundane things. This is not the real world MTV. This is, I want to be able to also visit my partner who has cancer in the hospital. And for example, we talked to a lesbian throuple who that is exactly what happened, right? One of the partners has a terminal illness, and one of the partners is married to them and was able to visit. The other one had to lie and say that she was her sister in order to go and visit her partner, right? And they also have a child together, and they're very concerned about the health benefits situation and the custody situation for the child. And so people are trying to love and support each other, right? They're trying to sort of live their lives and go to work and have loving relationships and have families and children, and not worry about those arrangements being under threat because of a lack of legal sanction. And so that is another area of work that we're just very excited about doing, that we really believe is going to be part of the future of the work of this movement.
Wow, you sound incredibly busy. And that all sounds amazing. What a broad range of different things that you're doing. That's really cool to hear about. I won't keep you too much longer, but I do have one more question that's a bit of a downer. Um, but so the Human Rights Campaign has declared this year, 2021, as the quote, worst year in recent history for LGBTQ plus state legislative attacks. What advice would you give to someone who wants to go into LGBTQ plus advocacy and or civil rights work right now in a time where it could be particularly demoralizing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of this movement and any other movement, it's always there's always progress and then there's always backlash, right? I mean, people kind of see that there is a way in which our society has been unjust because of the tireless efforts of advocates. Things change, and then people are scared or frightened of the change, and then there is this backlash. And so, I think that maybe my advice for people who are entering this field, or really any social justice field, is to balance sort of your fire and your passion and not losing that with understanding that there's no benefit to martyring yourself or burning yourself out to try and change things, because it's a little bit bigger than any of us, and we can't in ourselves control this whole society and how people are going to respond to these issues. And so I am like, keep fighting the good fight, because and believe and that you're right about this issue. Like, I believe with every fiber of my being that I'm right about LGBT equality, because I believe that we are people like everybody else, and people just want to be able to live their lives and thrive, right? And so I think that we're right about what we say about LGBTQ plus people, and they're wrong. And fundamentally, I believe that in the long run, that is going to shake out. But in the meantime, there's a lot of ignorance out there, and there's a lot of bigotry, and you can't I think it's not healthy to feel like it is all on your own shoulders to fix that, when really it's about everybody working together and harnessing the whole collective power of the community in order to share that work. And so I would encourage people to not lose faith, but at the same time, don't make this your entire life. Make sure you have balance. Make sure that you step outside every once in a while and look at the sun and just admire the planet, because it's also just a really beautiful, thing to live and be alive. And so just try not to completely forget that in your kind of passion and zeal to be a social justice advocate. And you'll stick around for a lot longer if you can do that, believe me.
Yeah, great words to live by, just for anyone. I think it's all about balance. As someone who with sort of a career marked by firsts, your trans youth handbook was a first of its kind. You were the first openly transgender editor of the Harvard Law Review, and now you are the founding director of this clinic at Harvard. You've just had a lot of firsts. Do you have any sort of last words of wisdom, because we are speaking to law students who are starting out on their careers? Any last words of wisdom or calls to action that you just want to share?
Sure. I mean, so I get this question a lot from, my students, right? Of well, they want to help and how. And I often hear from students who say, well, I care about immigration reform, and I also care about the environment, and I also care about systemic racism, and I don't know what I ought to do. In a way, they almost are implying that the question is almost what is the most important issue, right? And of course the answer is that you can't rank them by importance, because they're all important, because the inequality is important. And of course you care about multiple issue areas, because you care about more than just yourself and you have empathy, and so it's natural. But it's not maybe the most useful question to ask, what is the most important issue? Because the real question is, where can you make the most difference, not where anybody could make the most difference. And where people can make the most difference tends to be where their heart lies and where their lived experience lies. If you really think about it, you probably know what are the things that really animate you, and not just intellectually, but just on a really personal, visceral level. And you should just go and follow those things, because that's also where you're probably going to have more of an original or valuable insight into what needs to be done, right? Because it's not really that helpful. There's a lot of smart attorneys out there, and if you just needed somebody to walk into the NAACP or the ACLU or DOJ tomorrow and just litigate what's already on the docket, a lot of people can do that. But not a lot of people can say, well, due to my lived experience, I can tell you that we shouldn't even be doing this, and we should be doing that instead. Right. And actually, I was thinking about this the other day, that I picked this trans youth area partially because I knew that it was an area that even well-meaning liberals are squeamish about, and are squeamish about right now. And I was like, well, it's going to be a problem sooner or later, because it's a problem right now. And even talking to these funders, they're nervous about doing it. Right. And so that it means it's going to be important. I had no idea it was going to blow up as much as it did, but I knew it was an important area. And I knew that it was that it really mattered to people's lives. So really look inside yourself and your own experience and think about what it is that's really going to make you get up in the morning every day, because this work is not easy, and sometimes it's wearying, and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes you don't want to do it anymore, and sometimes you don't know what the right thing to do is. And having that lived experience and that grounding that this is really something that you can stand by, and that that is just like what sets you on fire, like that's going to be what keeps you going. So trust yourself and trust your gut.
Yeah, that's a really great answer and a great way to end this, because of course the Equal Justice Works Design Your Own Fellowship program is all about lawyers pursuing the things that really are important to them and that really speak to them. So I love that advice. Well, thank you so much.